Jim Sebenius, welcome to Built to Sell Radio.
Thanks, John. Delighted to be here.
It's so good to have you here. We're going to talk all about negotiation because I know that's your wheelhouse. And I also know you've got this amazing new podcast coming up, which I'm looking forward to digging into. So it's called Deal Craft. Just give me the backstory on Deal Craft. Why did you want to do it? And what are you going to try to accomplish with the pod?
You know, for the last 20 years or so, between the Harvard Business School and the Harvard Law School, though I'm not a lawyer, I work with them all the time, we've had a program where each year we honor a man or a woman from around the world who we call a great negotiator. And that's often diplomatic. So it could be somebody like George Mitchell for his work in Northern Ireland. It could be business, Bruce Wasserstein, for example, taking over Lazard. It could be somebody who stopped a war. It could be, artists, all sorts of people. And we did something similar. We honored James Baker, for whom I worked 100 years ago in the government, and a remarkable negotiator. And he'd been Secretary of State. And we honored him, and then we decided to go back and talk to all of U.S. former Secretaries of State who were living, from Kissinger on through Tillerson. Some passed away and so forth. And we asked them not about statecraft per se, but about their most challenging negotiations and how they handled it. Why'd they do this? What if that? And so forth. And, with the benefit of 20 years of these remarkable negotiations, in addition to all the normal stuff that I do, I just said, this would be really interesting to people to see how the world's best deal makers and diplomats handle the most challenging aspects of their negotiations. What might they do differently? What did they learn? How would they advise somebody else? And so I just began to think, in bite-sized pieces rather than as a lengthy book, a podcast might be interesting. And I have all these interviews, plus lots of other people who we haven't honored in this way, like John Branca, who I got to know. He's a music industry super lawyer, and over 30 of his clients, from Bob Dylan and the Rolling Stones and the Beach Boys on through Dr. Dre and so forth, are in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And his most famous client on the music side was Michael Jackson, and he did all kinds of things like buying the Beatles catalog for Jackson and all these other things. And his stories are really interesting. Steve Schwartzman, who I worked for many years because I was at Blackstone from the beginning, and so I spent several hours interviewing Steve about the early Blackstone negotiations, when it was a startup of 4 or 5 people, and each deal was make or break. And, it was a phase in my education because I'd left Harvard and I was there for several years. And
have you been able to figure out, Jim, any of the common personality traits? Because you've looked at it from government leaders, diplomats, but also much of your work has been in the private sector with privately held companies and large enterprise, private equity, and so forth. Are there any common denominators, regardless of occupation, that you see among great negotiators?
I see almost all of them. The personality types are as varied as you can imagine. There's some big personalities who dominate the room, like a Richard Holbrooke or a Steve, for that matter, Schwartzman. There are people who are very sort of, relatively reserved and almost quiet. What you notice is they are very authentic. They tend to be highly self-confident, even though not in an arrogant, in-your-face kind of way. Even the ones who say, I don't prepare, when you talk to them, they prepare like crazy, then they wing it. And it's, and what I would say is virtually all of them, really stress the importance of preparation, not just the numbers, which is, a necessary condition. If you don't have that, go home. But a much deeper understanding of the situation, and they really focus on this, and that's, I think, important both in business and government and the arts and nonprofits and so forth. Those are some pieces of it, but they're so different from different cultures. Some are engineers, some are lawyers, some are finance types, some are artists, and those are some of the elements. But I'd have to say, when people try to be someone who they're not, it almost never works. Who are you? And can you develop confidence, often through preparation? Sometimes I think it's just inborn in where you stand, what your value is, kind of what you want, and what you're, where you're willing to say no. And, kind of with that as a backdrop, you have a lot of very, very different types. I realize that doesn't give you an easy answer. And I've read endless books on, sharks and warriors and monks and all this stuff. And that's not wrong. It's sometimes helpful, but I usually find who are you? Can you have a confidence in yourself? And then are you authentic in a way that is both, I guess, two characteristics that a lot of people think of as opposites, I find tend to be combined. They are both empathetic in the sense, not sympathetic, but they can sort of inhabit the other person's mind and kind of see things from their perspective. So it actually can be very tactical because you can take advantage of somebody better if you understand them more effectively. But they're empathetic, but they're also assertive, and in the sense of they're not afraid to assert their own interests. And a lot of people think you're either assertive or empathetic, and they're opposites, but the great negotiators tend to be both. And you because they really need to understand who they're dealing with, so they can either do something jointly and cooperatively, or most effectively, push their own side. But they have to be willing to be assertive as well, whether it's quiet or abrupt. Rarely in your face. I don't tend to find that works very well over time.
Yeah, HBR did a research study years ago, or they published it at least, talking about the two most important qualifications of a great salesperson. It was empathy plus competitiveness. So in a way, it sounds very similar to empathy plus assertiveness. But so the pod's called Deal Craft, comes out September 9th. Yep. You're also an epic author. Kissinger, the Negotiator. 3D negotiation was one that piqued my curiosity. Can you just describe the concept of 3D negotiation?
Yeah. If you go to sort of almost any standard negotiation seminar, and there are endless ones, whether it's airplane magazines or wherever, you'll find seminars on negotiation. And the major focus tends to be what you do at the table. The direct, interpersonal, tactical kind of how you meet objections, how you make your case, how you're persuasive in the moment, how you handle cross-cultural potential friction, stuff like that. That's at the table. And that's important. You can make or break a deal there. But there are two other dimensions that I find great negotiators do very much of. And the second is what you might think of as deal design. And that's the art and science of crafting agreements that unlock value, obviously economic, but often psychological or personal or reputational, that unlock value, meaning whatever you or they care about, and do so in a sustainable way. So there's tactics, deal design, and then what I have found the most effective negotiators and the greatest leverage in a negotiation comes from what we call the third dimension, or setup. And that's all the moves that you make away from the table to make sure that you've got the right parties brought into the process in the right sequence, dealing with the right set of issues by the right process, and critically facing the right consequences of no deal. In other words, it's kind of the architecture of negotiation. So a great 3D negotiator is a sort of an architect of the process, a deal designer on the substance, and a tactician with respect to the people. So it's really those three. And I tend to find most people's phrase when they think negotiation, they think the tactics. And that's obviously important. But the more deals I do, whether they're small or large, the more I realize that the setup of a negotiation, have you got the right parties? Are they involved? Are you dealing with an agent who's filtering stuff through their own agenda? Is there, have you really the architecture? And that also has to do with the sequence, of the process, both who you bring in, the way that you deal, with the issues and so forth. Lots and lots of examples of this that we could go into, but that's where I think that's probably what distinguishes our approach. And when I say our, I'm thinking less of my work as an academic, but Harvard, like many universities, lets their faculty do 20% of their time outside, and which is basically a day a week or about 50 days a year. And I have an outside firm. We advise companies and governments from small to large. And there I'm, and that's where the setup moves tends to be our real differentiator, because there are lots of people who are pretty good interpersonally, but that piece is especially key. Now, sometimes the setup is really, is really simple. And frankly, one of the most important pieces of the setup is you focused on somebody who might be buying your business. How fully have you canvassed the possibilities of other people buying the business? Because the more that you can generate competition, obviously, the better you are. And Marty Lipton, who is like the de facto dean of New York's community of takeover, legal specialists, and that's not going to be for most of your listeners. But talking to him, he even roughly quantified the added value of of including a competing negotiator relative to greater negotiating skill at the table later on. And I wrote down a quote that might be interesting to your listeners. Marty said, "The ability to bring somebody else into a situation earlier is far more important than the extra dollar a share at the back end. At the front end, you're probably talking 50%. At the back end, you're talking 1 or 2%. And I think that tells you, and I found that, Millennium Pharmaceuticals, which is a company that was very small in Cambridge and now is a much more dominant player, their growth, there's a guy named Steve Holtzman, and they grew in part by acquisition, all sorts of things. But he said, whenever we feel there's a possibility of a deal with someone, we immediately call 6 other people. It drives you nuts trying to juggle them all, but it'll change the perception on the other side of the table. Perhaps more importantly, it'll change your own self-perception. Because if you believe there are other people who are interested, a bluff isn't a bluff anymore. It's real. And you'll come across with a whole other layer of conviction. Now, this is not news, but how much have you invested in possible competition? Whether it's canvassing your industry, whether it's competitors that might be interested in you, whether it's, a business broker or one of the, mid cap or small cap investment banking firms, the value of having other interested parties is immense. And that's part of the setup of a negotiation. Now, again, this is not news, but I can't tell you how often I've, been brought into a negotiation where they've winnowed it down to one party. And it kind of obviously discarded the others, and the one party kind of knows that they have. And you cringe because you really want to keep 2 or 3 of them warm. And it's hard to do that because sometimes there's just one obvious buyer. I understand that. But when if you're not looking for something, you're not likely to buy it. And somebody shows up, says, "Hey, I'm interested in your business." You get into the process. Have you invested in that competition? Really key.
Yeah, I love this, and I want to go further here because we talk a lot about competitive tension on the show and the importance of having multiple buyers.
Sure.
One of the big decisions that a lot of business owners need to make early is how wide a net to cast. If they go, maximum width, shall we say, and really cast the net wide, they're going to create the most competitive tension for their deal. The risk is, of course, that deal is going to get out in the public domain. People are going to find out. Potential employees, customers, suppliers are all going to find out because you've cast the net very, very wide. There's a second risk that I hear about, which is that there are some buyers that refuse to take part if they feel that they are being a pawn in someone else's negotiation, if they're just simply there to kind of fill the roster of potential buyers, they get turned off by this idea of like being one of many at the table.
Yeah.
And so there's this sort of give and take between like wanting competitive tension, but also not wanting to be so public about it that you turn off potential buyers and also other constituency. How do we walk that tightrope?
At the point, and I think what you say rings absolutely true. It's, and there's another thing. People don't want to be a stalking horse in somebody else's deal. A lot of people don't want to play in an auction. They're just, there are a lot of things like that. And that's where, I think you begin to feel things out, who the natural buyers are. And you can probably find, especially industrial buyers or people in the same industry, if there's a small roll up going on or there's there are other pieces of this kind, then that gives you some sense of who's most likely to value you the most. And that's a good place to begin to start. And you can let that be known, quietly that you're thinking about things. And if there are 2 or 3 of those, then that's really good. If they're not, then that's another story. But I think going out really wide is almost never a good idea unless all you've got is one other party. But the moment you've got a few, but I think and the potential buyers, I use the term natural buyers, but even before you've kind of focused and got the right party, who is involved, is you'd like to get a sense of who is either in your industry, interested in getting into your industry. There are just a number of examples, and I can think of, there was a really important case very early in my time at Blackstone where we'd made an investment in a steel company that turned out to be really quite a disaster. And the question was, in effect, how could we possibly exit that thing? And really trying to figure out who we would deal with. Because if we did an auction, it would probably be a busted auction, then we'd be even worse. And the question, it turned out that there was a company in France that was trying to expand into North America, and it was pretty large. And if you could pitch the value of this deal to them as an entree into North America, if the financial risk was considerable for similarly sized companies, but for them it wouldn't be a really big deal, you could almost paint a vision of how this would be a great entry point, how they could deal with some of the issues that had caused the financial problems with this company and so forth. And that might have made a significant difference. But again, it was finding the right party.
Jim, you mentioned the term busted auction. Can you just define that and describe why it's such a disaster?
Well, once you're in either a formal or an informal auction, and you haven't thought about it too much, and in some cases the buyers sort of know each other either explicitly or implicitly, you put it out there, and you either get real lowball bids that you're never going to go for, or worse, you don't get any bids. And then it's out there that you've essentially signaled that you have no options. And so you're really in a weak position the next time around, unless you've kind of positioned things. And that's, holding an auction that's likely to have that characteristic is really a bad thing. Because if you think about it, you talked about the importance of competition, and many of your listeners are, acutely aware of that. But what's your power in a negotiation? Your power in a negotiation is the difference between what a potential buyer sees if they acquire your company and what they would do otherwise. Do they walk away? Do they buy something else? Do they bide their time? What do they do? But that's the difference. That's the space for negotiation between, and the negotiation types have a phrase that you're probably familiar with, BATN as the best alternative to negotiated agreement. And you want to research what is the value to them of your company. And I must say, people often haven't really thought about that, haven't fully modeled how they will see your company. And it's, negotiation is typically not a battle of dueling spreadsheets. That's the surface. But what's underneath, one of the greatest financial negotiators of all time, Felix Rowan, who used to run Lazard and did a bunch of other things, he said to me once that, negotiation, selling a company is like 50% economics and 50% intangibles, other agendas, just a series of other things. And he said, if you don't have the 50%, if you don't have the economics right, forget it. It won't work. But assuming you have that, what differentiates an ordinary from a really effective negotiator is really understanding these other things. And they can be, stuff like, the employees be taken care of and so forth. But what I think a lot of business owners have not really done is modeled the value of your company, not just as they see it, but as how the other side might see it. And there's standard valuation techniques. You can multiples of earnings or revenue or EBITDA and so forth. You can look for comparables. Sometimes, people do a discounted cash flow analysis. Have you looked at earnings per share equivalent? If you look at a PE ratio, which is really an assessment of growth prospects, and it's sort of the implied value to get, the same, you're really looking at the incremental value of $1 of target earnings. Some people, believe it or not, spend a lot of time looking at book value per share, sort of looking at assets and, or dividends or something. And, or people will come in and they'll analyze, here's what my business is worth, but they're thinking on a standalone basis, not what is my business worth in combination with their business? In other words, have you modeled the potential synergies of the combination? Because that leads you to a really different place than this other. Now, I listed a whole bunch of ways which my finance colleagues or my investment banking friends would say 8 of them are flawed analytically. They've got all kind of problems and this and that. And with with all respect to my finance friends, that doesn't really matter. If somebody else is looking at it through that lens, you want to know it. And in fact, you want to look at all the possible lenses through which they will see your company. And you would like to shift the conversation to where it's the lens that you prefer. Because a lot of people will have done, they'll do comparables or they'll do simple multiples or things of this kind. But are they looking at it standalone? Is it market-based? Is it accounting-based? Does it include synergies? And what are the different classes of arguments that they're going to make? And how do you want to steer the negotiation so it's toward the most favorable kind of valuation on your side? And that calls for an assessment of how you think the value is, but even as or more important is all the ways that they might look at it, and what are the ways of those that are best for you, and where do you want to steer it away from? And that calls for a kind of an analysis that oftentimes people just don't do. They say, here's what the business is worth. Now, in some businesses, in some industries, there's just an obvious way. People say, look, it's X times earnings and that's that, or X times revenue and that's that. And that may be not a source of much leverage, but I've often found it's very helpful because it will set you up for the basis of the negotiation. Because
yeah, I think this is such important advice for my listeners. And we talk a little bit about, we touched on this, but never in such great detail. A lot of our listeners will focus on their company, and they may go so far as to say, well, if ABC company, Google, right, Microsoft, Nike bought us, we'd be able to sell more of our stuff, through their channels or their stores or whatever. Right. And we've often talked about doing the exact opposite, which is saying, think of it from Nike or Google or Apple's, standpoint. How much more of their stuff can they sell by owning your company? Mm-hmm. How many more, iPhones? How many more sneakers can they sell by owning your company, as opposed to how many more things, how many of your widgets you're going to sell by using their channels? I think it's similar. It's quantifying synergy, but it's looking at it through the lens, as you described, of the acquirer in this case.
Yeah, I mean, and how many times have you heard, step into their shoes or see it from their perspective? And that's almost a cliche, but it has real power. There's an Italian diplomat in the last century whose name was Daniel Vare, and in translation, he said, negotiation is the art of letting them have your way. In other words, how to shape their choice such that for their reasons, they acquire you in a way that beautifully solves your problem. And if you think about it, if you're trying to persuade somebody, do they do something for their reasons or for your reasons? And they do it for their reasons, right? So the better you can get inside their heads and understand their reasons, the more effectively you could shape your arguments such that their decision solves your problem. Now, there's a very cynical way of saying the art of letting them have your way. Sounds like manipulation. But actually, it's much more fundamental than that, because they buy based on what they see the value as, and the more effectively you can do that. And a lot of times, there's some simple things. Do they have any money? What's their debt capacity? Are there other currencies, like they're going to give you some of their stock, or they're going to take back some money, and so forth? Are they seriously interested, or are they just bottom feeding? Is it, kind of what do they care about? Something I've found in the last probably 5 or 6 years that some of your listeners might be interested in is, I've always tried to say, what can I learn from people who themselves have negotiated with your counterpart before? And if you're looking for that, it's surprisingly easy to find people who have done this. You look in LinkedIn, you look in other things, and a couple of inquiries, and you'll often find, hot buttons, areas where they were very successful, big screw ups, personality, kind of what do they respond to? They very fact based, or they open to big stories, kind of who are they? But there's another source that I've found, just open source intelligence, which is to say, there are all kinds of social media. And a couple of years ago, I and a few others wrote a Harvard Business Review article called Playbook for Negotiators in the Age of Social Media. And it's amazing what you can find out. And I'm not talking about any dark arts. I'm just talking about what's out there if you look for it. Because if you're not looking for something, you tend not to find it except by accident. And you find out about hobbies, and you find out about kind of people they've dealt with and who's influential and who's, you find out so much stuff that's there for the taking before you even get into that. So if you rely on human contacts, social intelligence, and then that gives you so much better an idea of with whom you're actually dealing. And that's as true if you're dealing with a Google or a Microsoft or an Apple, because you're not dealing with an aggregate. You're dealing with somebody there or a couple people there. And the more you find out about them, the more you're better, because that's so central to effective negotiation. John, there's another thing that, we were talking about valuation and understanding the other side. You might be interested in something that I've seen in practice and an experiment that's been done a number of different times that gives you a sense of valuation divergence. Would now be a time to describe that briefly?
Yeah.
I won't get into all the technical details. But I've done this with my classes, and I teach senior executives and MBAs who typically have 3 to 5 years of experience. We don't take people, for the most part, right out of college, because there's a huge difference between 3 to 5 years out and and 1 year out. In any case, so we've done this a bunch. And what I do is I take a negotiation exercise and I put them in teams. So if it's a class of 90 people, we'll have either 45 one-on-ones or, some do it in two-on-twos. And we give them each information on a buy-sell situation. And there's a description of the company and the industry and the financial statements and an industry analysis and so forth. And those who own the company get one set of information, and it's labeled confidential information. And the other side, say they get a green sheet. So this is 20, 30 pages of description and financial statements and so forth. And similarly with the other side, and they get confidential information for the potential buyer. And before the negotiation, what I ask them to do is go ahead and do an analysis and tell me what you think this company is actually worth per share, whatever basis you want. Secondly, what is your target? What would you like to sell it for? And what is the least that you would sell it for? And similarly, before the negotiation, I ask the would-be buyers to do the same thing, but from their perspective. What do you think it's actually worth? True, not tactically, not but just in your heart of hearts and based on your analysis, what do you think the thing's worth? And then, what do you hope to get it for? What's the most you'd pay for it? And so forth. Now, what's interesting, and here's the twist, the confidential information to each side is exactly the same. Exactly the same. Now, they're used to, in negotiation classes, they're used to getting confidential information where each side, knows, different things, which is normal in most deals. Now, the interesting part comes. How about the true valuations? When each reports to me before the negotiation what they think the company is actually worth. Remember, we've randomly assigned people to be buyers or sellers. And the people who are selling typically think their true assessment is that it's worth about a third more than the buyers, who think it's worth about a third less. And if you give this information to a finance class and you don't assign them roles, so they're not buyers or sellers, you just say, analyze what do you think the worth of the company is, comes out about in the middle. Now, this is not tactically is really different. Now, my psychologist friends have a name for this, which they call, quote, biased assimilation. And I'm not sure I have any idea what that means. But from my perspective, it's you believe your own line. You get caught up in your own perspective. And, and this is normal. It's, you expect people tactically or, to highlight the risks if you're a buyer and to be skeptical of a hockey stick and, all that kind of thing. But you should expect this as normal, in addition to the tactical and, and changes in, risk and so forth. So the question is, if you're going into a sales negotiation and you expect, even honestly, them to think it's worth less than you think it's worth, what do you do about it? First thing is, you shouldn't get enraged because they have, they've seemed to lowball you, because this is completely normal. And by the way, this kind of experiment's been done in lots of settings. Second, you need to be able to justify your valuation in depth. And the power of justification really matters relative to a number that you kind of think is right. But, having a justification, being willing to discuss it and so forth. If you get really stuck, I've seen sometimes the parties will jointly hire a third party for an assessment. Now, it's many times people will hire their own valuation assessments, and that's better than nothing because you can at least see what their methodology is. But oftentimes, those are biased toward the interest of the clients, and the other side views them as, advocacy pieces. But I have seen people say, okay, look, we're really stuck. We think this transaction has a way of happening. So you can sometimes jointly engage a third party and talk about how they're going to do it. And of course, earnouts are the other classic way to bridge a valuation difference. And I know you've had your listeners have, I'm sure, talked a lot about earnouts because they are very helpful. They also can be the lawyer's full employment act if they're not carefully drawn right. It's because you want things that are.
Yeah, what have you seen to be essential elements of an earnout deal? You're advising a YPO member or someone in your Harvard Business Negotiation Project class. Like, what are you telling them to think about as it relates to an earnout?
So the first thing is, I guess the first thing is, are these genuine differences in interest, or are they based on differential information? Because if I'm betting against somebody who's much more deeply informed than I am, I probably shouldn't take that bet. But oftentimes, people just see the world differently. And after you've talked about the basis, I see this, you see that. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is an earnout. You want to really look carefully at the incentives that the earnout sets up. So, for example, when somebody takes it over, do they have an incentive to make a whole bunch of investments that trash earnings for 5 years and they pay off much later? You'll see a version of that. Do you see, so are the incentives to the buyer to maximize whatever the element of the earnout is, or is that funky? Because the incentives can really be screwy in those situations. You often, sometimes there's something that's causing the earnout, that's causing the divergence in views that you can isolate and do an earnout on the basis of. And an example in this, I know that there was a small bank that I was helping. They were going to sell themselves to a larger bank. There was a pretty substantial lawsuit against them, and it was going to almost certainly drag out for a good while. Well, an earnout, if was essentially if the lawsuit phase is favorable, then the payout is greater. If the lawsuit is unfavorable, the payout is less. And you want to make sure that the acquirer has every interest in winning the suit. That's the case. And sometimes you can isolate something like that. And sometimes, an earnout could be based on something that's better covered by a hedge. So, for example, my business is really dependent on oil prices. And I think they're going up, and you think they're going down, and we might bet on that, but it may be better to just hedge that, in different ways. So I would say, what's the basis of the divergency in views? Is it informational? Is it risk? Is it what? What do the incentives look like? And do they give the acquirer the incentive to maximize whatever the payout issue is? If typically earnings, or it could be EBITDA, or it could be revenues, it could be lots of things. It just depends on the industry and the company. But I would say, and you can look. There's a lot of good things to write and just read about a bunch of earnouts. Because I would say in small business deals now, I think I saw the statistic. It was either PwC or somebody said, on the order of about 35-40% of small business deals typically have earnouts. So it's not small. And I know sometimes it is exactly what's necessary to bridge the value gap, and people are comfortable with it. And sometimes it just leads to tears. And I think you probably have a catalog of those yourselves. But those would be my suggestions.
Those are great suggestions, and yeah, we do have a catalog of both great and disappointing stories when it comes to earnout. So that's sage wisdom for sure. One of the other things that our listeners deal with is how to handle the question about what they think their business is worth. So it'll be early in a negotiation, and the acquirer will kind of put their arm around the business owner and say, "What what's your number? Like, I mean, I don't want to waste your time. You don't want to waste my time. Let's go for a drink and just give me a sense. What's your number? And I've heard two, very different perspectives on answering that question. On one hand, by giving the acquirer a number, you're effectively putting a ceiling on which you will never kind of sell your business before. And then, in fact, they will sort of take it as their life's work to make sure they get it below that. However, there's another school of thought. I think Chris Voss has famously talked about this kind of anchoring idea, which is to throw out a big number, right? So that makes them feel like, the other side is getting a deal by sort of putting a big anchor out there. Where do you land on this best way to answer this question that they inevitably will get early in the negotiation?
Probably there are two pieces of advice that I would give. The first is, how much do you know about their interest in the company? Because if you understand that very well, if this is a series of acquisitions and related, in the same industry, and you kind of understand where that's going, that's one thing. If this is an acquirer that you really don't know what their motivations are they really after a patent? Do they really want some land that could be, far more valuable to them if they had it? If they, because if you really don't know what their interests are, that's critical, because in the case like that, it can be a big mistake to it could be a really big mistake to throw out a number, because you can cap yourself way below what's necessary. The second thing I would say is, anchoring is a very powerful tool, and generally, when you what Chris says, I think is right, and there's a lot of academic study and a lot of practical work. Anchoring, it's sort of like X-rays. I mean, it's invisible. You know that you're being played, but it nevertheless has an effect, and there's a lot of evidence to that effect. However, you want to anchor high enough, but with a justification, because if you just put out a number and you haven't got a justification, it probably won't work. And the number should certainly be fairly aggressive. I worry about letting the other side put out a number first, because I worry about being unfavorably anchored in a situation of this kind. But I would say you should definitely, let me say this a little differently. There's a trade-off in the early moves in negotiation between influencing their perceptions of the value and learning about what the real situation is. And sometimes I may want to let them go first, because I might learn something really valuable, especially if I don't know much. But I don't want to let their first offer put me in a bad situation. Can I tell you a short anecdote about this?
Yeah.
This goes back to Thomas Edison, and he'd invented, he loved to invent, and he really didn't like business, and his company, of course, ultimately became GE. But he invented something, the electric stock ticker, which could transmit a large volume of stock prices over large distances quickly. And the president of the New York Stock Exchange found out about this. They wanted to, acquire the rights to it. And there's a retired General Laferrets. And Edison had spent about $50 in equipment. Now, this is the late 19th century, figuring out this thing. He knew it was worth a lot more. So he tried to figure out a number that was really high. And he figured, 100 times that, $5,000, big money at the time. And he practiced in front of a mirror, because he did not like to negotiate. He practiced with his wife. He was ready. And General Laferrets came. There was some small talk, and and General Laferrets said, "So, Mr. Edison, how much would you require for the rights to your invention?" And Edison was just about to say $5,000, but all of a sudden it just felt so greedy and so excessive, and so potentially off-putting that he just sort of froze. And the general said, "Mr. Edison, are you feeling okay? Is everything all right? Would you be willing to sell for $40,000? And he's really glad that he kept his mouth shut. It's because you can imagine if he'd said 5,000, the general would have said, "Well, it's unproven, maybe 3, and settled on," you can imagine something like that. So if you really don't know what the value is, you want to be very careful of being unfavorably anchored or setting an anchor yourself. On the other hand, if you don't think you're going to learn a whole lot, then you're very wise to set a fairly aggressive anchor that you can justify, even a little bit, with a straight face, the largest number that you can justify with a straight face, and leave some room because they're definitely going to try to push you down from that. So those would be the two things that I would say are really key. Understand their motivation. What's the trade-off between learning and influencing, and go from there.
That's super helpful. And I love this idea of, what you're going to learn from letting them go first. However, if they've already said, for example, in negotiation, look, we bought 9 companies in the last year, everyone we bought for less than 5 times EBITDA. Like if they've already told you that, then perhaps throwing out a higher anchor and with justification gets them off their, the number they've already set.
Because the last thing you want to do is let their lowball number have weight in the negotiation. So if you said 5 times revenue for this business, I can't, that is so low. I can't imagine 5 times. That's crazy. I would never sell for 5 times. What are you doing? You're digging 5 times in, then you're going to be negotiating 5 times down rather than 5 times up rather than some other number down. You really don't want to give it weight. I understand why other companies would do this. We're different, and here's why. And we're looking at something of the following kind. But again, your power in negotiation is the added value that they see relative to what they would do otherwise. And that's really, if you're trying to psych out one thing, it's that delta. Because then, if there is a delta, now sometimes there's not, and there's no deal. But that's really what you're always looking for.
Yeah, and I think that's where the art of negotiation sort of takes over from the science, because drawing that out of an acquirer in a subtle yet consistent way is really challenging, right? Because of course the acquirer knows that by giving up too much information, they're losing leverage in negotiation. So the last thing they want to do is sort of tell you their entire strategic plan. Any secrets, Jim, for sort of drawing out from an acquirer what they see as the strategic value, without being so forceful that they shut down?
Yeah. Well, what I would say is here's why the early effort, even before the quote unquote negotiation starts, the more that you can learn, the better. Because when you're in crunch time, they're going to be very defended against giving out any information that might not work to their benefit. So that tells you need to work before crunch time. And that's why when you're thinking about selling, talking to a series of people, kind of what would be their interest, how might that fit in their company, we're giving some thought to selling and moving on. You want a convincing story of what you're going to be doing then. Because that social stuff before there's even a negotiation gives you a lot of clues. Secondly, you want to talk to people. If they've bought other businesses at 5 times, go talk to those people. And say, what were these guys like? What is the argument that they use? What do they say no to? And so forth. You will find that. And again, this is a very different thing, but I was really curious about how to negotiate with a real hardball player, and the hardest of hardball. And I have my students and executives and so forth, give me their examples and so forth. And I said, no, that doesn't even rate. How about the following? How do you negotiate with Vladimir Putin? Does that qualify? And, people have some advice and read stuff and so forth. I said, you know what? The best advice I could give is go talk to half a dozen people who themselves have negotiated with Putin. And because, I mentioned our Secretaries of State, I asked Colin Powell, what was it like? How much did you negotiate with him? What was he like? What was this, where and so forth? And then I asked the same thing of Condi Rice, who was a Russian speaker and a student of Russia. And I asked Hillary Clinton, who could not, Putin couldn't stand her. How do you negotiate with her? And she had some really interesting insights into this thing, as well as, Rex Tillerson, of course, who'd been head of ExxonMobil and had known Putin from the late 90s because of the work of Exxon in Russia and so forth. And, and each one of them had different advice for dealing with this. And if you talk to those people based on their direct experience, you had such a better feel for how to deal with this guy than if you read some books or a briefing memo or whatever. And it's there's a lot of interesting stuff, but I say that's a serious negotiation. Not they won't give me the valuation that I want.
Yeah.
Again, not to denigrate that, but the broader point I think is often neglected. They come and they say we bought 4 other companies at X times. Good. Which ones have you bought? I bet you know those people. Talk to them. They're not going to tell you. They won't tell you confidential stuff, but they'll give you useful atmospherics. They'll give you some hot buttons. They'll say whatever you do, don't do this, or they're gonna, look, they're always going to try to cut you in half. So create fake meat for a hungry animal. It's there's, it's there's a lot of things like that. And some people, when they put a number down, that's what they are, and they never change. And it's very useful to know that because you don't want them to put down that number if
Right.
you find out that that's the case. And there are people like that.
Yeah, the whole concept of the highest and best offer, like
Yeah,
this is the one and only offer that
there's a
that
big
we're.
difference between the rock bottom offer and the rock bottom offer. It's
How do you
often,
decipher the two? Because in a negotiation at the letter of intent stage, the owners are often trying to get an acquirer to raise their price, and ideally they've followed your advice, and they've got a couple of other potential bidders at the table, so they've got a few options, and they're trying to gin up the price by playing one off the other a little bit. And and of course, every acquirer is going to say, look, this is our final price. And to your point, sometimes that's true, and other times it's not. Is there any way they can ferret out whether you know someone saying this is it, this is our final number, is actually genuine?
you really have to be paying close attention during the process. And the second thing is, again, going to what's the source of your power in a negotiation, because you've got to find a way to let them climb down from that if you've assessed that they really do have more value in this. So a remarkable negotiator that I know is a trade negotiator, Charlene Barshevsky, a terrific private sector lawyer as well. There's a point at which, this is a negotiation in China, and somebody said, that's it. Take it or leave it. And he's a really great big guy, and she's a relatively small woman, and it's almost a physical threat. And she said, "Well, if you really mean take it or leave it, if that's take it or leave it, obviously we have to leave it. But I don't think that's what you meant." And then kind of let's talk through this. I'm not sure. I respect what you say, but what about the following and so forth? The first question is analytical. Do you see that they still have significantly more value in the deal? And that's an assessment that you really want to be making, because if there is a lot of value, that final offer may not be. I think that's one piece. You often will get the equivalent of final offers, but if you change things slightly, you say, so that's a final price. How about the following? And you can change the issues a little bit. It's, as you say, that's really art. And you want to see how somebody behaves. And you say, I understand that. I respect that. If we were to think about it slightly differently, I would see this. And what do you think about that? Or I don't think I can do that for that, but I could do it for the following. Because, if you could do this, I could say yes. I can't sell that to my wife, my board, my whatever, but I could sell the following. Is there a way that we can find how to do that? And that could be a closing bonus, or there's lots of ways around it. But at that point is you look at you're just watching them like a hawk, and you have been watching them like a hawk. And if it's been a lengthy process and they've kind of converged on something, you also want to ask, are they pretty shrewd at this, so that they've their concessions are getting smaller and smaller, and they're converging on an obvious point, and that was kind of the plan from the beginning? Or is it pretty genuine going through? Because a lot of times, look, they're genuine, you're genuine, and you try to find what you can. Which is a really great way of saying what an academic might, which it depends.
Well, there's obviously
Yeah.
tremendous art to this. Last question. I know your time is precious, so I'll let you go. But one thing that I'd be remiss not to ask is about retrading. So, of course, a lot of the deals that our listeners strike are ones that are committed to in a letter of intent, and then there's the diligence period, and then there's obviously the final share purchase agreement. And oftentimes there's some shrinkage or some erosion between the letter of intent and the final share price. And I've characterized it as kind of legitimate retrading and illegitimate retrading. So legitimate retrading, it'll be, they've discovered something material in diligence and they've got to lower their price. That seems to be realistic. I'd be curious, though, how you might handle what the owner believes is illegitimate retrading, meaning there's nothing they discovered material in diligence. They're just using the fact that the owner is emotionally committed to selling to try to retrade.
That's very common. Very common. That is very common. And I like your phrase. I don't think I've ever heard the sort of legitimate, but I certainly know the concept. What I would say, the best advice I can give is to anticipate and talk through. We have a letter of intent. We've got a term sheet. It's not complete, but this is the essence of the thing. And let's talk through the kinds of issues that are, we've already dealt with, that are already here. We've got these contracts, we have this customer list, we have this technology, we have these patents and so forth. And I would never think you would do something like this, but I'm not open to rethinking those. If you need to think about those, let's think about the term sheet. I want you to look deep in this, but we are now at a point where I've turned down other offers when they shrank too much as a result of just trying to retrade the deal. And I'm not going to come back to you and ask for more. And I don't want you to come back to me and ask something in this category. So if there's something we both overlooked, let's talk about it. But otherwise, these are here. So I would say inoculate. And you can make it two ways. You can say, look, I'm not going to come back and retrade it. Once I know that you've invested all this due diligence money and the rest of it, I'm not going to say just one more thing, like Columbo, which often sellers do. When the other guy is committed a lot of time and resources to this, then they come back and they want something else. You say, look, I've seen people do that, but I also see people do it on the other side. I don't think you would do that, but I just want to be very clear. And the more that you've anticipated that explicitly in a non-insulting way, the better protection you have against it. And you need to be willing to walk. Jim, or at least have the apparent willing to walk. Because the moment it looks like you can't, somebody who wants to take advantage of you can. A lot of people are honorable or pretty honorable. And anyway.
Jim, I'm so grateful for you sharing your wisdom. I know it's been hard earned, so thank you for doing that. The new podcast is called Deal Craft. It comes out September 9th, I believe. I wish you all the success in the world. If people wanted to reach out, learn more about you, the pod, is there a website or a social media connection that they can make?
Yeah, sure. It's fortunately, Sebenius is a very unusual name, Sebenius. But Jim Sebenius, JimSebenius.com works as my personal website, or through Harvard Business School. I'm linked to all kinds of things. It's very easy to find me there. And John, thank you. I really I like your questions, and I love the predicament that people who've built a business and now they're in another stage. I just wish them all the best, unless I'm on the buy side.
Jim, thanks for doing this.
All right. Take care.